evening. Thank you for coming out on this relatively rainy evening, although I'm happy to say it's cleared up, to talk about sign ordinances. My name is Caleb Rossico. I am a, is this working? Okay, well, I'm gonna disregard it. I am a consultant with a firm called TSW who has been hired by the City of Tucker to help update the overlays and the sign ordinance for the city. And the purpose of the meeting tonight is to tell you, the members of the public, where we are. We've been working with the Tucker stakeholders for several months now, and we're at a point where we want to hear back from folks before we actually start the process writing. So the purpose of the meeting evening is to fill everyone in on what we've done to date, talk about some big ideas of proposed changes, and then talk about very specific changes to the sign ordinance, the overlays, and by overlays we mean Mountain Industrial, North Lake, and Downtown Tucker. We'll then have a Q&A session, and then very importantly, we want to give you an opportunity to provide us with feedback on some of the ideas. I mentioned my firm is called TSW. We are a local firm that specializes in codes and development regulations, but I would be remiss if I didn't also point out that we do have a zoning attorney on our team with Cooley Land Use Law, who's helping us sort of behind the scenes on a lot of the technicality. The purpose of the project, from the city's perspective, is to have an independent review of the 4 ordinances that I mentioned, then to put together completely updated ordinances that are hopefully more user-friendly, consistent, and clear, and obviously do this as part of a public outreach process, which is why we're here today. Also very important to the city is to make sure that when we update these regulations, we really incorporate other initiatives that the city's been working on. For example, the recently updated comprehensive plan, the Livable Centers study, which is a plan for both North Lake and Downtown Tucker. And then, of course, meet all of those sort of technical aspects of a more user-friendly code. So we've been working for a couple months now, as I mentioned. The first part of our process was a review and analysis. We had a series of meetings with the public and with stakeholders to understand what aspects of the regulations worked and what aspects of the regulations did not work from their perspective. Equally important, my company and our attorney read through all of the ordinances to make sure that they were legally sound and to really begin to identify areas where they didn't match what was in the comp plan or the language was somewhat cumbersome. From that, phase 2, which is where we are now, is about confirming direction. We've had the conversations about where we believe Tucker wants to go, but we want to hear from you. Once that's done, only then do we actually begin the codification process, the process of actually writing the regulations. We'll have a series of meetings associated with that, and only when that's all in proper order does it begin the official adoption process through the City of Tucker. So again, here's where we are today. For those of you, how many of you is this your first meeting, out of curiosity? So a couple, okay, great. Well, for those of you who are new, welcome. But for those of you who are not new, you'll remember that this is really our second major public meeting to talk about the sign ordinance. The first meeting was held in September and was really about beginning to get general ideas from the public on what works and what doesn't work with the existing regulations today. We had a whole series of exercises where we asked people to give feedback on a bunch of different things in the overlay. There was feedback on potential changes to specific regulations. There were stations that asked people to comment on overlay boundaries. And then there were actually even a series of image preference surveys where people could look at images and tell us if the signs were appropriate for Tucker, if so, where, and then in the case of some of the overlays, if they were also appropriate in those areas. And so all of that, the image preference survey, the technical analysis, the community feedback, and the stakeholder steering committee have got us to where we are today, which we're calling the big ideas. So before we get into the specific regulations, I wanted to let you know that these three big ideas are, or should I say 4 big ideas, are really universal across all 4 sections of the code. The first thing that we are recommending to the city, that the city allows us to do, is to make the language clearer and easy to understand. If you read the ordinances today, you can see they're really written for attorneys. And we believe that zoning and sign ordinances should be things that the business community and homeowners can understand. And so we have a lot of experience in creating legally defensible language that isn't quite so obtuse. And so we'd like to incorporate clear language into the process. Additionally, we believe that this process should incorporate better use of graphics. Sign ordinances and development regulations are increasingly incorporating sketches, photos, other aspects of graphics to make the code easier to understand. Graphics never supplant the code, but they always support it. So if there's a regulation that doesn't make sense or is unclear, we'd like to use graphics to make it more usable. Additionally, we'd like to work on the layout. Your current zoning ordinance, which includes the overlays but not the sign ordinance, is a bit more user-friendly in terms of structure. The sign ordinance today is just all words. It's very hard to process, to digest, unless you're used to working in that. So we think there's an opportunity to clean it up, make it more user-friendly, and consider page layout. And then finally, I left out the most important thing because it's hidden at the bottom. We do want to make sure that to the extent possible, we put things in tables, because tables are increasingly easy to understand and make a code more user-friendly. So with that said, I'd now like to talk to you about the sign ordinance. Now I'm only going to touch on some of the highlights, because these type of changes really fall into 2 categories. There are what I would call technical cleanups, which are things that the public generally won't have an interest in, such as reformatting, such as changing a minor term. They're really not changing the regulation as much as they're making it more user-friendly. These changes are what we call policy changes. They're where the actual thing regulated would change. And so I want to touch on those because those are really the meat of the updates. The first thing that we'd like to do from the sign ordinance is to make your ordinance conform with all recent Supreme Court ruling of content neutrality. Today, the code is legally defensible, the code is legally valid, but the best practice is not to talk about differentiation between whether a message is commercial or whether a message is not commercial. And so that is called content neutrality. It's something that all new codes anywhere in the country have to incorporate, and so we'll be incorporating that into the cities of Tucker. Now, above that, there is another sort of less glamorous aspect of your sign ordinance that we would like your permission to clean up. And that really relates to the issue of maintenance. The maintenance provisions are, or could be created to ensure that signs are kept in better condition, to ensure that they're maintained, and then very importantly, that they're kept in good repair. Your code does have some of that in here. We think it could be cleaned up. One of our feedback from the community was that that is a particular area that needs to be cleaned up, and so again, we're proposing to do that. A couple other changes related to the sign ordinance. You have some squirrely requirements for sign setbacks that actually relate to the street curb and not the right-of-way, not the property line. That's problematic for several reasons. Obviously, it could be interpreted as allowing a sign in public right-of-way. We'd like to clean that up. We'd like to make sure it's clear that all signs must be on private property. We would like to develop standards for awning signs, signs that are really sort of on the bottom of an awning. The proposed language would define better what they are, would require they not to be internally illuminated, so they can't be glowing. You may have seen where I think Subway is a good example where the whole sign will be glowing, the whole awning will be glowing. And then of course, believe it or not, we've actually seen developers in other communities who put awning signs at the roof of the building where there's no window. And so we just want to make sure that if it's an awning sign, it has to be over a door, has to be over a window on the ground floor. Now another change, and we know this is a big one for Tucker, relates to the issue of electronic signs. So today, electronic signs are illegal in most of the city, but there are a couple of locations where they're permitted. Based on the feedback from our sounding board, we are actually recommending to not allow new electronic signs in the city, to just take them out, make them prohibited citywide, which is one of the things that we would really like your opinion on tonight. Equally, another citywide prohibition would be what are called monopole signs, which you can see in the image on the right. These are effectively signs that are on a very small pole, and they would be prohibited under the proposed changes. In their place, you could have what is called a monument sign or a ground sign. That is more aesthetically pleasing, more consistent with some of the recent signs in the North Lake area. Another prohibition of signage would be murals. Again, based on feedback from our steering committee, our advisory committee, we have recommended to put forth that no murals would be allowed in the city of Tucker. Really the most well-known example being adjacent to Matthews. Obviously that could continue, it's there, any existing murals could continue, but no new ones could be created. And then finally, there would be a proposed prohibition of neon citywide, although there is one caveat that I'll mention in a moment related to the little open signs in building doors. Another area of change is portable signs, which are these sort of sandwich boards, but there are other types of signs as allowed. We would like to continue the allowances to have sandwich board signs in downtown and portions of North Lake, but we do think there needs to be some more clarity about where they go. So they cannot be in the middle of the sidewalk, and so we propose writing regulations for their placement there. We would also create regulations that prohibit signs attached to vehicles where they will take a vehicle, they will paint a sign on it, and they will park it 365 days a year in the front of the property to get around the sign ordinance. That is an area where we can clean up as well. Another big issue that we've heard from the Tucker community relates to temporary signs. And by temporary signs, we mean signs that are not permanently affixed to the building, things like banners, things like grand opening signs, etc. We would like to significantly clean up this part of the ordinance to specify where temporary signs are permitted, how many you can have in the course of a year, and then incorporate permit requirements for those types of signs. Related to that is that one of the things we've noticed in Tucker is that sometimes temporary signs actually become permanent. There are a couple businesses around the city where the banners have been there for quite a long time, and so we just feel it's important to clean up the regulations so it's absolutely crystal clear where temporary signs and banners are allowed, how long, and then beyond that they're not allowed. Another area of change is wall signs, and wall signs are those that directly connect to the building facade, like the Verizon sign in the photos there. There are typically regulations in a sign ordinance that prohibit wall signs from covering windows. No such requirement exists in Tucker, or other architectural details, things like doors. If it's a historic building on Main Street, the cornices, that is something we would like to propose. There is also a very unusual wall sign provision currently that says that you can do bigger wall signs in the city of Tucker if you are above the 12th floor. Now if you think about how many 12-story buildings we have in Tucker, or how many the zoning would allow, it really means it's a remnant from DeKalb County that has no place, and so we'd like to just simply remove that. And then finally, related to wall signs, we would like to create a standard for what is called a raceway. And a raceway is what most people think of as the structure that actually supports the sign when the sign may be mounted. There is typically language in a sign ordinance that says that that raceway must match the material of the building, and we would like to incorporate that into Tucker as well. Now, I mentioned a few minutes ago, we were also going to look at neon signs. We would propose developing standards for signs that are in windows. And some of those signs, particularly open signs and those small and the beer signs and those type of smaller signs, may be neon. And so we would like to write regulations allowing those in very limited quantity because the code is not as clear as it could be today. Additionally, we would like to really clean up how that is limited today. Today the code says you can have 30% of your window, but it really is unclear. Does it mean all the windows in the building or just that individual pane? We would like to clarify what the language means to be perfectly clear. So those are, in a nutshell, an overview of the sign ordinance changes. The second set of changes is within the North Lake overlay. Probably the biggest change here is that we heard over and over and over again that the North Lake overlay really isn't a true overlay. Typically, what a true overlay does is it adds regulations on top of what are allowed in the underlying zoning. So if you're a commercial property, it may say the commercial property has to have brick or it has to have a pitched roof. What your overlay does is actually more of a zoning district. Your overlay changes the permitted uses, the permitted density. It really is a type of zoning district. It's not a true overlay for any sort of extent of the imagination. And you know, DeKalb County did it that way, but with the city of Tucker independent, we think we're recommending just to create a new zoning district called North Lake, which would actually be a series of districts. The proposed sub-areas of North Lake would be aligned with the current sub-areas in the North Lake overlay. There would be one for the high-intensity commercial, one for the office park sub-area today, one for the employment center sub-area today, and actually a new one for this area called Vistadale Court, which I'll show you in a moment where that is. So Vistadale Court, is everyone familiar where that is? Okay, well, I don't know if I have a pointer here. Maybe I do on here. Here we go. So La Vista Road runs, downtown Tucker's over here, passes 285, the mall's right here. There is actually what was a residential neighborhood that was rezoned many years ago for a commercial development that never happened. Because of that, it's zoned commercial, but the houses are still there. And from hearing from the stakeholders, there is a desire to allow that area to continue to have that character and be a transition between sort of the high intensity of the commercial core of North Lake and the neighborhoods to the east. So we're proposing to create a new zoning district for just that little area that would incorporate that character that exists today. So that would be added to what is now thought of as, would be carved out of what is now thought of as North Lake. Additionally, in looking at the map and in talking to stakeholders in the area, the overlay today and what is thought of as the commercial district in North Lake don't actually overlap. If you look at the map here, you'll see that there are some areas just to the southeast of 285 and the railroad that are actually thought of as North Lake. They're in the North Lake CID, but they're not in the overlay. And so we would like to add them to this new district as in a way that reflects their current office uses today. So that would be a relatively significant change. So that's the North Lake area. Some of the specific regulations that we're proposing to update, and I'd like to point out, we envisioning carrying most of the North Lake regulations over significantly unchanged. But there are a couple of areas. The first is that the current overlay talks about connectivity, it talks about block sizes. We would like to clean up those regulations, make them clear, so that as new development occurs, it's very clear what the expectations are for laying out new blocks and streets with the idea of providing interparcel access. Related to interparcel access, which really is a shared driveway, for those of you who don't know that technical term, the overlay today gives developers a bonus for having shared driveways and for having the ability to drive from one business to another as redevelopment occurs. We would like to just make that a requirement everywhere. It is very consistent with Georgia Department of Transportation policies. It's very consistent with the need to reduce traffic congestion on some of these key corridors. And quite frankly, Tucker is one of the few cities I've seen that doesn't just mandate it right out. And so we're proposing to require that as new development occurs. Existing properties would not have to make any changes. Now there are a couple of sign ordinance changes in the North Lake area. North Lake has its own sort of subset of sign regulations. The first one is there's this strange requirement today that storefronts that are set back 200 feet have additional sign requirements. We don't really see a reason for that. We would like to just use the current citywide standards, so we're proposing to take that out. We would like to keep requirements for channel cut signs, which if you look at the graphic on the right, I know it's hard to see. Channel cut effectively means that the letter is cut out. So the Chick-fil-A at the top, that's actually a three-dimensional letter applied to the facade versus a painted sign or a single sign at the bottom. That is a requirement today. We would like to propose to keep that requirement in the future. But there is one requirement that, again, as a third party is somewhat unusual. Typically when a sign is regulated, you just give an applicant a sign area, 32 square feet or 40 square feet. Tucker does that in North Lake, but then it also has a maximum letter size, which is very unusual. I don't know where it came from. I don't know what happened when DeKalb wrote that, but we are recommending just take that out. It's very challenging, especially if you're a business. I'll use Nukes as the example, if you know the company. Nukes is a soup company. Their N is very large. Their EWKS is very little. And the way the sign ordinance is, the N cannot exceed 24 inches, which means that the EWKS you can't even read. So we just like to take that out, tie it to sign area like it is everywhere else in the city, and give a bit more flexibility, really in coordination with best practices. In North Lake, we'd also like to, these are relatively minor changes, but we would like to acknowledge the fact that the city of Tucker has an ongoing trail plan and streetscape plan and incorporate that into the code to make sure that as development happens, as redevelopment occurs, in addition to just having to widen the sidewalks, that if there's a trail there, the developer also could put in the trail instead of the sidewalk. And also to incorporate those customized streetscape requirements for certain roads, La Vista Road really being the one that is called out in the existing city LCI plan. And then the final aspect of North Lake is that there are a couple of uses that are actually allowed there today, which are very unusual, and they're all agricultural uses for the most part. So you can do a dairy in North Lake, you can do a livestock sales, you can do a riding academy, you can do a mobile home park. Those really, in my opinion, and the opinion of the folks we've talked to, aren't compatible with what that area is and what that area is becoming, and it's very unlikely someone would ever build them to begin with, so we'd like to just take them out from permitted uses. Second area is downtown. A lot of similarities in terms of structure to North Lake. We are recommending to get rid of the downtown overlay and just call it the Downtown Tucker Zoning District. And it would incorporate all of the three sub-areas that exists today. Neighborhood zone, corridor zone, and village zone. Pardon me. The boundaries here would change a little bit. You can see the 3 zones in the map here. The boundaries today do not exactly align with what the city considers to be downtown Tucker, what is called the Tucker Downtown Character Area. So what we would do is effectively expand the 2 to match. And those expansions would be adding a couple of parcels, really 4 parcels. I know this is very hard to see, which is why we have it over here. Adding a couple of parcels on Claremont, extending south to pick up Cowan, is it Cowan Drive or Cowan Road? Cowan Road. Pardon me, I cannot even read this. And then picking up the 2 shopping centers to the east, so that they're all in the overlay today. They'll all have the same types of design standards. We would also, like in North Lake, incorporate block size requirements, incorporate interparcel access requirements. We would also we're also proposing in the downtown area to slightly reduce the minimum parking for commercial. And the reason for that is today, downtown Tucker has both a minimum parking requirement and a maximum parking requirement. But they're not actually different, they're the same. So that intuitively doesn't make any sense, because how can you have a minimum and the maximum is the same? The developer would have to provide that number. So we'd just like to lower the minimum a little bit to give some more flexibility to applicants to have a range so that it intuitively makes sense. There are a couple of architectural things that will be incorporated into downtown. The first is to come up with some enhanced requirements for storefronts and for shop fronts. You have a very established architectural character on Main Street. We want to make sure that new development is compatible with that in terms of having large glass storefronts, having certain materials on the storefronts, so that they really reflect that almost historic feel today. There's also a proposal to require a special land use permit for drive-throughs. Drive-throughs are permitted today. They would be permitted in the future, but there would have to be a special land use permit process to make sure that pedestrians and vehicular safety are considered as part of reviewing those. There are also a couple of changes proposed for signs. One would be to prohibit internally illuminated signs in downtown Tucker, and to also prohibit what are called backlit silhouette signs. If you see the cactus sign right here, that's what a backlit sign is. The bottom is an internally illuminated sign. We would also propose to incorporate the streetscape requirements into this code, like I mentioned with North Lake, both along La Vista Road and in other areas. And then finally, in downtown Tucker, here there are also a couple of uses that really don't seem to conform with what the comprehensive plan says about the area and what the area is becoming today. The first of those is cleaning up the definition for what a live-work unit is. The code allows live-work. It doesn't just define as what it is as well as it could. And very importantly, extremely important in my opinion, you may or may not realize, but today, in that whole downtown Tucker area, there are actually limitations on how big a store can be. So things like Walmart or Kroger far exceed that. And that's one of the things that my company noticed very early on, is that the caps are very low. I believe they're 10 and 15,000 square feet. We would like to propose a mechanism where applicants can increase those, especially because we're adding all the shopping centers, via special land use permit. We'd also like to do that for offices. Part of the vision of downtown Tucker is to have jobs, to have housing, to have shops, but you limit your offices to 10,000 square feet, which is much smaller than the bank right out the way here. So we would like to also allow office users to have a bigger office presence via the special land use permit process. 10,000 square feet is extremely small for an office user, and if Tucker is to truly become a live, work, play downtown, we believe that's an important change. And then, of course, there are some specific regulations that I'll let you read outside, but things that are allowed here that really are not, were carried over from DeKalb County and may not be appropriate. Agriculture, fortune telling, a lot of uses that the stakeholder committee suggested were not appropriate. And so the final area, and then I'll stop talking, is mountain industrial. Not a lot of changes in mountain industrial. This is a relatively new overlay. It would continue to be an overlay, but there are a few. The first change is after reaching out to the business community and conducting that visual preference survey I mentioned, we found that the material restrictions, what a building can be made of in mountain industrial, are a bit limiting. Today, you have to have a masonry building or you have to have a stucco building. There's nothing else allowed beyond that. But if mountain industrial is to ever continue to grow as an industrial district, you're seeing more and more industrial uses and laboratories using other materials as well. So we'd like to propose to allow a glass curtain wall building, which is really, when you think of a modern office building, that kind of building. We'd like to allow terracotta and ceramic panels, which are what most of the new Class A office or even the industrial buildings in the region are doing. And then we'd like to allow certain types of metal cladding. And by metal cladding, I don't mean galvanized metal, I don't mean unfinished steel, but there are also metal architectural panels that are very attractive that could have a role in that area as it continues to grow and evolve. We would also incorporate, we're proposing to incorporate interparcel access here and to make a few adjustments to permitted uses, including outlawing mobile homes and coming up with better standards for outdoor storage. There's a lot of outdoor storage in the area. The overlay was intended to address that, but there are a couple of loopholes that are in there that we would tighten up as part of that. So in a nutshell, that really is an overview of the direction that we're proposing to go before we write anything.